Awesome. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Isabel Regani, and I'm the president of MacSER. So we're very excited to have you all attending the How to Do an Online Presentation event. I would just like to remind everyone that this event is being recorded, and if you wish to submit a question, you can do so in the Slido. I pasted a link to that in the chat.
Perfect. Thank you, Isabel. Hello, everyone. My name is Yasmin. I'm the Vice President of MacSER. And now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ebrahimi, an assistant professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Depends on where you are coming from. Welcome to this presentation. Before I start the presentation, I just want to remind you right at the bottom of the Zoom link, where you have control on the video and the audio as well. There is an option live transcript. So if you guys need to have the caption available, you can turn it on, or if it's automatically on at your end and it's annoying and you don't want to have it, you have the option of turning it off there. So that's something that I wanted to mention right at the beginning. Let me start sharing my screen. Screen one, share. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, it's good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, this presentation, we're going to focus on how to do an online presentation. I've never done this before, but this comes from my own experience, like what I've learned during my PhD and maybe like during past year of teaching online version. I wasn't like a comfortable person delivering things online, but again, this slides has been put together and this kind of workshop style has been put together based on the experiences that I've had in a couple of years. So Yasmin briefly introduced me, but just to know a little bit more about me, I'm Shelir Ebrahimi. I'm the assistant prof within chemical engineering program. I did my PhD in chemical environmental engineering, so that's my background. I got my PhD from the University of British Columbia. During like the third or the last year of my PhD, I was kind of knew that I want to focus on the teaching stream just because of the training that I had, like 8 months training that I had. So after my PhD, I tried to focus on the teaching, and I'm so honored that the title of the UBC 16 Rising Star was announced, and I was one of them just because of the dedication that I have to the teaching and pedagogical research as well. I did my postdoc at University of Toronto and then joined MacMaster. My research background is water, and it's focusing on the environmental engineering because that's my background. So I'm not going to admit those people, so I'm just going to remove it from my screen. The research interest, it's mainly focused on the water and wastewater treatment processes. I'm not going to talk about that. That's going to be a very long story. But again, as I said, I focus more on the teaching portion and focusing on the engineering education. And the courses that I teach at MacMaster includes the third-year course of heat transfer, which chemical engineering students and some material engineering students take that. I don't know if I have any of my students here. And also I teach the Capstone course within chemical engineering department. I'm also involved in the Engineering One program, or I think these days we call it an experiential learning office, that huge 13 credit course that we developed, and for the first time we delivered it in fall 20, Engineering 1P13. So I'm one of the 8 instructors who teach that course. If we have any future students, welcome, and I hope that you enjoy this presentation and your journey in general at MacMaster. I don't have access to the question form, but I'm sure they will tell me if there is any question during the presentation, but we'll have time for the Q&A at the end. So this presentation of like how to do the online presentation, I decided to have it in 2 different categories. One, preparing ourselves for the presentation, how we are going to prepare the slides. And again, it's focusing mainly on the PowerPoint presentation because there are tons of different ways that you can present online. So we focus on the preparation of that, and we'll talk a little bit about the accessibility because that's the big part these days, right? Especially like during the pandemic that we switched everything to the online version. we didn't have lots of knowledge about digital content and how we need to prepare them to make sure it's accessible. And I learned so much in this past year. I'm going to share part of that. Again, it's not the area of expertise for me, but I'm going to share whatever that I've learned. And it was a great experience. And I was kind of ashamed that I never thought about this stuff, probably like before pandemic. Lots of the course content and course materials that we were sharing with the students probably were not accessible. So it's good that this pandemic journey happened and now we have lots of knowledge about the accessibility. So I'll talk a little bit about that, because now I think it's kind of the general expectation. Whatever digital content that we have, whatever presentation that we are preparing, whatever documents that we are preparing, we need to have like the basics of accessibility in mind. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about the entire room prep and all of that matters for the online presentation, and then some tips about like how to do the actual presentation. We'll talk about, if we have time, I'll show you a quick demo of recording the presentation if you need to create pre-recorded presentation and not necessarily a live one, and some general tips about all of those. So we'll talk about the preparation for the presentation and what we are going to do during the presentation. So I start with the accessibility, and part of these slides are coming from the workshops that we have had with the accessibility office. They have great resources, but again, I'll bring part of the summary of what I've learned from them. I provide lots of links during these PowerPoints, and I can make it available for you guys and can be shared with you. You can have access to all of those links, but they have great resources. So I highly recommend you to look into those. So in general, when finding digital accessibility, we are specifically referring to making electronic content available and usable by everyone. At the same time, with the same use, including and especially focusing on the persons with disability. And that should include different disabilities, like the visual impairment, hearing impairment. We need to keep everyone in mind. And that should be what we are referring to whenever we want to create any digital content, including the presentation, online presentation. So there are some principles. Again, I don't want to go through like lots of details and spend lots of time on that, but maybe I'll just bring up the important things that you need to consider. So the main principles when we are thinking about the accessibility, it's perceivable. So what does that mean? Information and user interface components might be presented to users in ways they can perceive. Operable, it must be operable, able to be used. And again, these are general terms, but as we go through tips of how making a PowerPoint accessible, then you understand how it's referring back to these principles. It has to be understandable. Information and operation of user interface must be understandable. And of course, robust. Content must be robust enough that can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of users, including those users that may use different technologies to assist them to understand the digital content. So again, we can have like more than 2-3 hours workshop on accessibility and how to make the digital content more accessible. But let's just focus on some important tips when it comes to the online presentation and preparing online content, focusing again mainly on the PowerPoint. So the first thing we think about the fonts, right? What type of fonts we're going to use and what type of fonts we should avoid. I remember probably when I was doing my PhD, it was always use Times New Roman for everything. That when you're creating poster, when you're writing a report, that's the best font to use. But that's not the case anymore because it's hard to read. And although like I don't have any disability, after this year of experience that most of the digital content that we have been facing, they have considered the accessibility thing. When I go back to the old version of the documents that I have that are not accessible, it bothers me actually. So it makes our life way easier when we just pay attention to various small things. So for example, the fonts that you should be using, it has to be sans serif fonts, and Calibri and Arial are the best examples of those. So avoid like Times New Roman because of those edges that the letters have. It's going to make it hard for people to read it. When it comes to the size of the font, you shouldn't be using anything smaller than 18. So it has to be larger than 18. It's very typical number, it's 24. Usually 24 is the best, but it really depends on the type of the slides that you're creating. But keep in mind, it shouldn't be smaller than 18. The spacing between the lines, 1.5, that should be the minimum, just to differentiate enough between the lines so people can read it easily. We have to avoid underline. We'll talk about that, unless it's for the hyperlink. So we shouldn't be using the underlines in the actual text that we have in the PowerPoints. And types of fonts that we shouldn't be using, any compressed fonts. And there are just a couple of examples, but in the list of the PowerPoint, you'll see lots of examples. So anything that has the edge, anything that is compressed, or any decorative fonts, you shouldn't be using it, and you should avoid using them. Again, I know, like, for example, if you want to make like decorative posters, like to advertise something, you may want to go a little bit fancy, but these are the rules that we need to follow when we are thinking about the professional documents and professional presentations. So again, like digital materials, when it comes to the presentation, you may have different documents that you are willing to use. For example, sometimes we provide handouts ahead of time. So if you have any articles, handouts, or essays that you want to share before your presentation, you need to make sure that they are machine readable. Again, in this workshop, we are focusing on the PowerPoint presentation, but I'm providing some links to you. For example, learn what are the tips that you need to include when you are working with the Word documents, just to make sure that they are machine readable. So that's the important thing. When it comes to the videos, you need to make sure that they are captioned. Again, the best experience would be giving the audience the option to turn on or off the caption. But if you don't have that option, you need to have the caption on all the time. Podcast, you need to have transcripts. Again, sometimes you may not use it, but it's just good to know. When it comes to the images, and we'll talk about more details, you need to provide alternative text for the people who cannot see the image. If it's like live presentation, you need to explain it really well, so whoever that is listening to the presentation understand what you're talking about. If you're providing the document to the people, then it has to have alternative text. So if they're using the machine readable software, they can read the text that is related to the image if they cannot see the image itself. So those are really important points to consider. Before creating the PowerPoint, when it comes to the accessibility, you need to ask yourself, who are the learners or the audience? There are usually like two main options. Do you want to provide the slides to them ahead of time or no? Usually when we think about the online presentation, unless it's like for teaching stuff, we don't provide the slides to the audience, right? It will serve strictly as the visual presentation aid, and they do have access to it only during the presentation. So we'll talk about the tips if that's the purpose of the presentation. Or you're going to ask yourself, will it serve to act as a tool for post-presentation support? So for example, are you going to provide the slides before the presentation or after presentation to the audience? So if it's the first one, if your file will not be distributed, attention should be given to the visual components of a presentation, such as color contrast. Again, you need to consider all of these, even if you're providing the slides to the audience, but let's focus on the important tips that you need to include if you are using the slides only during the presentation. So the color contrast is really important. We'll talk about that. Text styling is really important, and text spacing is super important too. If you are distributing the document, you must ensure it's machine readable. So maybe you don't need to think about being machine readable if you are just using the slide for presenting and you're not providing it to the people. Or distribute in another format. I know, like, especially when it comes to the teaching, there is this guard that people don't like to share the editable version of the documents that they have. Usually they prefer to have everything in PDF when they want to distribute it to the people. It's not very common to share the Word file or the PowerPoint, original PowerPoint slides itself. We usually share it in the PDF, but there are lots of difficulties and challenges when it comes to the machine readable software when you are dealing with the PDF document. So it's highly recommended, if you need to distribute something to the audience ahead of time or after, provide it as a Word document or the actual PowerPoint slide itself. Again, this link, this is hyperlink. I'm not going to go through it, but I've provided to you. You get access to these slides. You can take a look to see what are the tips that you need to consider when you're creating the accessible Microsoft Word document. I've already talked about this. We shouldn't be having any underlined text unless it's hyperlink. So it should, whatever that it's underlined should take us to another sources. It can be a web page, it can be email. Otherwise, you shouldn't be underlining anything that's not accessible. And I know like that's very common that we usually use, right? The color contrast, it's really important. Either you are just using the PowerPoint during the presentation, or even if you're providing it like as the kind of document that you distribute before or after the presentation. So there are lots of resources that you can use to understand the color contrast. So I'm just going to quickly maybe show, and again, there's a couple of links here. That color contrast analyzer, this link will take you to the web page that you can easily download it. And let's see, I should have it here. So I want to show it to you. That's really cool. And I highly recommend you guys to use it because it's super easy to use. Let me see, where do I have that? Okay, here. Come on, my laptop is so slow today. Okay, there we go. So this is so cool. First of all, if you know the HEX number, and I'll tell you how to find that in the PowerPoint, and also MacMaster has a guideline on that too. If you know that, easy. If you don't know it, it's even easier. So as you can see here, there is like that color picking item. So I can easily select that. And one part, as you can see, let me just escape this. One part is for the text, for example, that you're using, and one is for the background. So you can easily like select those. I'm gonna just check, let's say that my background, even if I can go on my PowerPoint, right? So let's say that I wanna compare the contrast. It's super easy. You select that. So it's gonna say, okay, your foreground, it's that color. What is your background? It's gonna be white. And here it's telling you that the contrast ratio between these two, if your background is white and the text color that you're using, it's this maroon color here, then the contrast, it's 11.1 to 1. I'll talk about those numbers and what those means, but I just wanted to introduce this CCA, which is super easy to use, and it's super helpful actually to understand the contrast. Even for the background, I can just go, let's say I'm going to use it on blue, and then it's the ratio, it's going to be 3 to 1. Okay, so that's super easy. Again, this link here will take you to that website, and you can easily download that software. It's super cool. In PowerPoint itself, if you go to home and just check here the font color thing, there is the eyedropper here too, so you can easily check that. And let's say I'm gonna go for what color? This color. And then if you select that, it's already here. But if you go to more color option, it's giving you the HEX number. Usually you don't need that if you're using CCA, but if for any reason you need to have the actual HEX number for any color that you're using, PowerPoint gives you that access to, so you can easily use that. So let's say what that means. So I told you the tool that you can use to understand, like figure out the contrast or the ratio of the two colors that you're going to use in the background as a text. But when it comes to the accessibility, WCAG, which is the Web Contrast Accessibility Guideline, there are some ratios that are important. So when it comes to the numbers, we need to have minimum contrast of 7 for body text and 4.5 for headers. Headers, usually we use larger fonts, so that's why we can go with the less contrast. So we need to keep that in mind. If it's like the body text 7, it cannot be smaller than 7. If it's the headers, then 4.5, it's okay. And these are just some examples. So these numbers are showing the contrast of these colors. on the white background. So maroon, which is very typical color that MacMaster uses, it's 11, it's perfect, it passes both criteria. Heritage gold, it's 1.6, it's really bad, and as you can see on the white, it doesn't show really well. Gray, it's 5.5, and some other options here as well. Then I have like another slide that shows the contrast on black. So as we can see here, maroon, it's not good at all. It's 2.7, and the best case among these, it's the heritage gold. So this is a very simple and quick check, but it's enhancing the accessibility of your slides very much. It's not even about the accessibility, right? It's especially when it comes to the graphs, it's super important to make sure that the colors that you're using have enough contrast, right? So those were for the text, when we have the text on specific background. When you have like colors that they kind of have overlap, for example, if you're using it for specific graphs, then those guidelines are going to change in terms of number. We need to have at least 3 against the colors that have kind of overlaps. And these are just 2 examples. These 2 colors, the gold and the maroon, they have a contrast of 6.7, and the gray and maroon, the contrast of 1.9, which is not good. So again, very simple, but very important trick to use the color contrast. I love it. I love working with that CCA, just play around and see what happens. When it comes to the graphs and diagrams, first of all, the best thing is not using color to convey the meaning of the graph, because it can be confusing even if you have the contrast in place, right? So it's better to play around with the type of line that you're using. For example, use full line or the dash line, as you can see here, right? When it comes to the graphs, explaining the meaning of the visual by color is going to be hard. And when you are publishing the articles, most of the papers, they just say, okay, have the graphs in the black and white, because not all of the people, if they want to have access to your articles, are going to print it out in color, right? So you need to make sure the type of graphics that you are providing, it's going to be still understandable if someone prints it out in the black and white. So just make sure, if it's possible, and I'm sure that you can figure it out, it is possible all the time, not to use color to convey any meaning. And if at any case you have to do that, just make sure that it has a sufficient contrast of that 3. Again, there is another link here that in 5 minutes tutorial, it's easily tell you how to create accessible charts. As I said, we can spend hours on the accessibility of the documents. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are resources available at any point if you feel like that you need to refer to them. Alternative text, we already talked about that. This is usually for people that are blind or they have like visual impairments. So it's really important to explain what the visuals that we have in the PowerPoint. Again, verbal explanation, it's one way of doing it, but if you're providing the document to the people, you need to make sure that you have the alternative text for each image that you're providing. It should be very brief. On PowerPoint, let me see if I can find it. It's usually in review, and if you go to the review, check accessibility, you have the alt text option, which provides you a kind of, if I had an image here, we do have a slide on that. It gives you the option to write an explanation for that. So you can easily do it. And if those people are using the machine readable software, then that software is going to read the alternative text. So that's something that you can consider too. Again, this is just an example. So for example, you can just explain, you can just say it's a decorative image if it is decorative image and doesn't have any other purpose. But if you're using specific image that it's conveying any meaning, you need to kind of explain that. Again, another link to like full tutorial to explain what to consider when you're providing alternative text. But bottom line is you need to make sure if someone cannot see the image, if it's a live presentation, you explain it well. And if you're providing the document for the people, then it does have enough alternative text so someone that cannot see the image or the graph can understand it easily. Okay, so when it comes to the video content, as I said, having caption, it's really important. If you are the video owner, Just use, I'm sure that you guys have access to the Microsoft team, and when you have like Microsoft, you have access to the Microsoft stream. It's the captioning there. It's really easy to use. And again, we'll go through a demo quickly and show you how to do that. Or Mac Video. I'm not sure if all of the audience here have access to the Mac Video or not, but I usually use Microsoft Streams. It's super easy. Any video that you are the owner, you can just upload it there. It creates the caption. You can download the caption file and use it. If you're not the owner, you can contact the owner and request them to kind of activate the automatic captions, for example, on the YouTube or anything else. But you need to make sure any video that you are providing as part of your presentation should be captioned. Okay. Reading order and outline view. Again, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but I just wanted to show you, if you're providing the document for the people to that are using the machine readable stuff, on PowerPoint, if you go to the home and if you go to the arrange, right at the bottom selection pane, it was already active, I guess. It's kind of showing you the order that the machine readable software are going to read the context. So you can change that order. It's usually like bottom to the top. As you can see here, it's picture 5 first, which is this one. And then it's content, placeable holder, picture 3. You can change that order. So technically, this is telling you how machine readable software are going to read this slide for the people. So if you need to change that order, that's another cool feature that you can check on PowerPoint just to make sure that it's fine. And another thing that I'm going to right away show you here, I think because it's another slide there, you can check for the accessibility as well, as I showed you before. So if you check accessibility, it's giving you some errors, like for example, I don't know, in this slide, for example, you didn't use alternative text, and it kind of provides you the tips to make sure that the slides that you're using are accessible. Another thing that you can check on the accessibility office website, they have lots of master slides that you can use. If you use them, it's going to be super easy because they have been developed by having accessibility in mind. So you can easily use them as a template and start there from, so you don't have to do it from the scratch. You can just use those master slides that they have. It's going to be super easy to use, and then you are kind of sure that our accessibility points have been considered there. Again, there is another tutorial that kind of guides you through that. I highly recommend that. I usually, like, especially like during pandemic, I start using those master slides because they're super helpful, and I've already talked about this. Okay, before I switch the gears to like what you're going to do when you want to present. So we assume that now we know how to prepare the slides. Do we have any questions that you want me to answer at this point? Yasmin, is a little, or we're good.
We can leave them at the end. I don't see anything urgent at the moment.
Okay. So the second part, now when it comes to like preparing for the moment of the presentation itself, what we are going to wear. Again, we are talking about the online presentation. When it's in person, usually we wear more formal attire, but we need to keep it kind of formal during the online presentation as well. Don't go with like half business, half casual, because I sometimes feel like that's very common, like that we have the pajamas on, but like the shirt that we have, it's kind of formal. But to be honest, you never know what happens during the presentation. Maybe you just want to go and close the window, close the door, or you have to like stand up at some point. So it's good to make sure that like the whole attire, it's a formal attire. So avoid pajamas, don't wear t-shirts or sweaters or sweatpants, just avoid those. Doesn't have to be, again, fully formal like the in-person presentation, but still you want to keep it kind of formal. Be mindful about the surrounding. You don't have to use like very formal backgrounds, although I love the backgrounds that our hosts, they have it here. It's so cool, but you don't have to do that if you don't want to. Just be mindful about like the surrounding. Don't have like lots of clothes around. Be organized and clean. But again, if you don't feel comfortable, you can blur like the background, or you can use any of those images that you want to as the background. If possible, try to have a quiet room. I know like it's super hard these days. Like this last couple of weeks, I have been preparing for the summer course that it's going to be completely asynchronous. So we need to record lots of videos. And I figure out that the only time that I can do that, it's 5 to 7 a.m. because that's the only time that the house and the neighborhood is quiet, because we have like some neighbors, they have 4 kids always in the backyard screaming and playing, which is fun, but I can't do any recording there, or taking care of the lawn. It's so busy and crazy. So I know like after this pandemic experience, people completely understand and appreciate that sometimes it's not possible to be in a quiet room. But if it's possible, just try to have that. In general, try not to have a distracting surrounding. That's the whole point. When it comes to the presentation itself, always introduce yourself. If you can, tell a bit of a story about yourself. When it comes like to break that ice at the beginning, we usually use we say like bridge in. And usually the best thing to do is just tell a bit of a story related to the topic that you want to talk about, right? It's always, when it comes from the personal level, you click with the audience and they pay attention to the presentation. If it's not a personal story, that's fine. Just say something very interesting that can be related to the topic of your presentation. So always keep in mind that bridge in portion right at the beginning of the presentation. Make sure that you have an agenda. You can spend like 1 slide on that. Just say what you're planning to do. Make sure that you have the slides number. I did bold that because that's a very simple but typical mistakes that the students make. I teach capstone course, so that involves lots of presentation. So when it comes to Q&A, people don't know which slide number refer to if you don't have slides number. So that's super important. Make sure that you have that. Be very enthusiastic about what you're presenting. Again, it's super important when it comes to the online presentation because we don't have that eye contact, the body language, it's not very visible. So you need to kind of use your voice to make the presentation a little bit interesting and connect with the audience. Always leave enough time for Q&A. If you're someone like me that, well, not just like me, teachers are famous for talking so much, but try to manage the time and leave enough time Q&A at the end. And it's good to like have your contact information at the end, just in case if people are reaching out to you. Some other tips. Have it about like 4 to 5 inches from the microphone, whatever microphone that you're using, and keep that distance consistent. I know like sometimes people move a little bit when they speak, but have that movement like sideways if you need to. Just keep the distance to the microphone consistent. For example, if I'm coming closer to the microphone, then it's going to get louder. If I go back, then it's going to be quiet. We don't want to have that when we have the online presentation because it can be a little bit distracting and annoying. So that's important to keep in mind. And speak naturally. It's good to have scripts if that's your style of presentation. It's not mine. I never prepare scripts because that like kind of distracts me more. So I usually go with the flow. I practice sometimes, not in the last couple of years. I think when I started teaching, maybe that's what my habit, but I don't practice it anymore either. I just like to go with the flow. But if writing the script gives you the confidence for the presentation, sure, have that. Still, I recommend you to have it in the bullet point style. So it's not going to limit you, and if you forget to say something, you don't get distracted, you don't get nervous. Bullet points organizes your mind and you know what you need to talk about, but still it's going to be very natural. Even if you want to write the whole script, that's absolutely fine, but don't read from the script like a robot, right? It's like one need not sound like a robot to be understood by one. So that's a very typical thing when we have the online presentation. We write like scripts, but we don't pay attention when we are reading from the scripts. We lose that connection with the audience. So that's really important. Even if you're reading from the script, still keep that passion when you're talking. Describe your visual. I already talked about this. And again, I'll see this a lot in the capstone presentation just because of the time limitation that they have an image, they have a graph, and they just maybe talk about it in like in 5 seconds. That's not helpful. When it's an online presentation or general in any type of presentation, you shouldn't leave it to the audience to read the whole thing and figure out what's happening there. Whatever that you have on the slides, you should talk about it. So if you're not going to talk about an image, or if you're just going to talk about it in 5 seconds and say, this is the image who presents this, without explaining what it's really presenting, then you don't need to have it on the slide. So just keep that in mind. Whatever that you have on the slides, you should be talking about it, and you shouldn't leave it to the audience, because they don't have time to read the slides and use their own judgment to see what a graph or image is presenting. When it comes to the live scenarios, especially if the online presentation is getting recorded, and we provide that recording usually for the people who didn't attend the event, right? So you need to make sure that you're going to repeat the question, right? Because if you're reading it from the chat and you start responding to that question, when it's getting recorded, then the people who are watching the record, they have no idea about the question. So we usually forget that, but that's really important tip to just keep in mind. Read the questions loud when it comes to the live scenario and you're recording the event. Have your camera on if you feel comfortable. I highly recommend that, especially if it's a group presentation. It's good to see everyone in the presentation. Sometimes it's cool when people have the same background, you feel like they are in the same room, so that's helpful too. Have your mic off if you're not speaking. But again, if you're that type of person like me who forgets to turn the camera on when they start speaking, it's fine. Just leave it on. That's absolutely okay, because people forgive if you're coughing or it's a little noise from your side. People forgive that. But if you're talking, like, I don't know, for 30 seconds and no one can hear you, that's not good. So if you can have that habit to turn it on and off, that's cool. If not, just leave it on all the time. That's okay. When it comes to the group presentation, have one person responsible for sharing the screen and make sure that person understands the flow of the presentation really well and feel comfortable sharing the screen, because you don't want, like, during the presentation telling the person, next slide, please, next slide. That can be a bit distracting. So have someone responsible for sharing the screen and make sure that person understands the flow of the presentation really well. Have someone to monitor the chat. Do not do anything distracting when someone else is presenting. Just feel like you are in the same room and someone else is talking. That's fine. It's not your turn, but don't do anything distracting, like reaching out for something else or leaving the chair. If something happens, that's fine. But in general, just try to be mindful about that. Practice ahead of time. Again, all of the group members, just to make sure that you understand the flow completely. Okay. I think we do have time to go through a demo, like if you need to record a presentation, because sometimes, like, especially these days, it's kind of a requirement for some courses that you need to have a recorded presentation when it comes to the group work. I do have the slides that walks us through the steps, but I think we do have time just to show the demo. Again, I'll just show one way of doing it. There are tons of ways, but a very simple way of preparing a pre-recorded presentation is using Microsoft Teams, that I'm sure that you guys all have access to it. So unfortunately, I cannot, like, start a meeting and show you how to record it, because that disconnects me from Zoom. But in Microsoft Teams, at any, like, the team that you have, I usually, like, create a video recording team for myself, and I have, like, all of the practices and everything in there. There is a button there that you can start a meeting. And when you start a meeting, again, it's 3 dots. I'm sorry, I can't show that just because it disconnects me from Zoom. It's 3 dots that gives you the option to record the meeting. When you record the meeting and stop recording, then it's going to save you the recorded video here. If it's a group presentation, make sure that you kind of set your status on please do not disturb, so you don't get any notification from Teams or anything else. It doesn't pop up on your screen because you want to record the video. And make sure that you have everything handy. I don't know if you want to use any simulation document, if there is any other link that you want to use, make sure that you have it handy, so during the recorded video, you don't have to look for stuff. So let's assume that you have done the recording. And again, all of those tips that I talked about, like about the group presentation applies here, like the same background, and just make sure that everyone has the camera on and those types of things. So when it is recorded and it's saved here, if you click on those three dots, open the Microsoft Stream. I'm gonna bring that here. So I guess I just did it like for maybe 10 seconds today. So we have a sample here. So as you can see on Microsoft Streams, it creates the script for you and you can edit that, but it's usually really good. Barely you need to edit it. Even like for myself that I have accents, still picks words really well. I still need to edit it a little bit, but it's really good. So I highly recommend you to use Microsoft Stream. There are lots of options here. You can trim the video. Then if you like done with the editing and everything, if you go to like the update video details, you have the option to share it with different people. You can change the name. And here, actually, you can download the caption file if you want to use it for any other purpose. So Microsoft Stream, it's usually the best option, I would say, if you need to create pre-recorded video. That's just one example. And again, these steps that I just explained, we have it here in different slides if you want to refer to them later. But yeah, just a couple of points that I already said. Make sure that you have it on the do not disturb option so you don't get any notification, making sure that you have everything ready. Start the meeting in the channel. When you are settled in and ready, then start recording. And when you are done the presentation, stop recording and go through the other steps to edit the video or anything else. I think, yeah, I don't want to go through these because we already did this. How are we doing on the time? I think we're good. So we aim for about like 45 minutes, 50 minutes presentation, but I'm happy to answer any questions that we may have.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really, really helpful. We did send in a Slido link in the chat. If you guys have any questions, you can submit it. I see that we have a few questions, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask the first one. Are there any techniques you use to feel more confident when presenting?
Practice ahead of time. So that's really important. Again, it depends on your personality. Practicing, it's always helpful. So always do that, especially if you don't do lots of presentation. Again, when it comes like teaching, when you do it a lot, you feel more comfortable. But right at the beginning, you need to practice that just to make sure that you are spending enough time on the slides. When you practice, you know, like what kind of information you need to kind of explain. So practice, practice, practice. That's super important for the time management of the slides and also understand what you need to say about each slide. If you are type of a person that get nervous during the presentation, I recommend you to have the script, not full scripts, because like, again, based on my experience, when you have full scripts, if you don't follow it, you get nervous. I highly recommend it to have it in the bullet points, so you know exactly what you want to say, but still you don't have the full sentence, so it gives you a bit flexibility. Never ever memorize, because when you memorize something and you forget it, then you're locked and you don't know what to do at that point. So don't memorize. Just the best thing, have a script in the bullet points and practice ahead of time just to make sure that you are comfortable.
Awesome, thank you. And our next question is, how do you capture your audience's attention at the start of a presentation?
Okay, at the start of the presentation, as I said, if you think about that bridge-in option, usually tell like something related to the topic that you want to present. If, again, really depends on the topic that you want to say, but the bridge in is bringing the actual thing that maybe happened recently or sometime in your life, if you want to bring personal stories that connects the audience to the topic. So I don't know, if you are talking about the climate change, see if there is any recent news related to that. And you can just say, maybe you have heard about this news that just happened yesterday. This is what I'm going to talk about. So very brief thing, but you want to kind of bring an example from the real world that connects to the topic of your presentation. If you can find like personal story or personal bridge in story, better. But if not, just use whatever that is out there.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
Our next question is, are there ways to make asynchronous presentations more interactive?
Is it for the purpose of teaching? Or no, it doesn't say. There are lots of ways, actually. You can have animation. There are lots of software that you can use. If you take a look at the Macpherson Institute webpage, they have lots of resources there that, like for the HP5, that you can use like the recorded videos and incorporate like the animation into it. If it's for teaching, even if it's not for teaching purposes and you just want to make it interactive, you can have like the quiz style type of thing in the middle of the presentation and just check to see if the audience was following the presentation or not. You can use like those tricks just to stop the presentation, introduce something. It can be like the quiz style, it can be animation. If you have been using your voice for the presentation, maybe it's good to bring a little bit of the video clip or something just to change that environment of the presentation to make it more interactive. But yeah, there are lots of resources for that.
Awesome. So the next question would be, how do you prepare for your presentation? Do you practice it a few times alone, or do you practice with someone else?
That's a good question. I guess that depends on the type of person that you are. I usually do it alone. I feel more comfortable doing it alone because I can go back and forth. But if you want someone to provide feedback, it depends on the content too. So if it's like a presentation about the type of research that you have been doing, it's good to do it with your supervisor or, for example, another student who has been working on the same topic to provide feedback on the technical aspects as well. But if it's just solely for the purpose of the presentation and feeling comfortable with the content, I think doing it alone, it's going to be more beneficial because you can go like back and forth. You don't feel like you're wasting someone else's time. You can pause at any time that you want to. And like when I practice, usually for the first time, I don't pay attention to the time. I just go through each slide, try to present each slide, even if it's like 3 or 4 times for each slide, that's fine. I just want to understand what I want to present in each slide. And then when I feel comfortable with every single slide, then I practice the timing of the overall presentation going from the beginning to the end.
Perfect, thank you. I practice with a teddy bear, but same thing, they can't judge me.
Yes.
Our next question is, when recording videos on Microsoft Teams, is there an option to make them private?
Oh yeah, you mean like on Microsoft Streams? If the channel that you have created, and the one that I showed you, it was just my own channel, no one is part of that team, then except you, no one else can see it. So when I have a video in that channel that I'm the only member, it's gonna be released only to me, unless when I go to Microsoft Streams manually, I say, okay, make this available to all of the people in my organization, or it gives you the option to like add Mac ID, like to give access to specific people. If you don't do that, then it's going to be private, only you can see it. So yeah, if you want to keep it private, create a team, like what was the name of my team, like video recording. Don't add anyone else, it's just your own private team, and have all of the recordings there, and it's going to stay private. Yeah.
And then our next question is, I'm bad with memorizing what I have to present, especially if it's scientific, but I know reading off a card or screen isn't super professional. So would you have any advice?
Again, practicing, it's going to help. It doesn't matter if you're good with memorizing or bad. I don't recommend memorizing stuff. Even if you are good in memorizing long text, don't do that, because when it comes to the live presentation, you get nervous, and that's natural, and you may forget something. And when you have memorized something and it comes to the point that you don't remember it, you lose the whole flow of the presentation. So don't memorize at all. The best thing, as I said, having this script in the bullet point. So I know it's not professional to read it from script, and that's why it's good to have it in the bullet point, because you're going to just take a look at, I don't know, a piece of paper, even if it's like in-person presentation, that's fine. You have like a small card. You just take a look at it for like 5 seconds. You talk about that bullet point, right? for a couple of minutes, and then you can take a look at another one just to remind yourself what you're talking about. Bullet points, it's going to be really helpful. It is professional, and it's not going to make you nervous either.
Last question is about access to the slides, and I already posted a chat. We're just going to kindly get the slides off of you after the presentation, and we'll post it on our Microsoft Teams community for MacSER that we've created. I also sent in the join code, so if you're not in it, you can go ahead and join right now or after. Up to you.
Yeah, that's perfect. We are going to share the slides in the PowerPoint format just for accessibility reason. I have that on the slide, but keep in mind some of those slides are coming directly from Accessibility Office, so credit goes to them if at any point you want to use them anywhere.
Awesome. So that's it for our question period then, if we don't have anything else. So I'd like to thank Dr. Ebrahimi for sharing her insights into what makes a great online presentation. I'm sure that everyone's learned something valuable that they're going to apply, especially being an online school. And if you want to stay updated with any events, be sure to follow us on our social media. It's just at MacSER. And then we'll be posting our event updates there. And then for everyone else, have a great rest of your day or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. And feel free to reach out to us at any time. Thanks.